I wanted to turn to the other cases and the statuses there. We were talking about the civil fraud case and the judgment, and I know Letitia James is challenging the validity of his bond in the civil fraud case. What's your assessment of where he's at? I mean, and his ability to pay, and how that bond plays into the outcome.
Yeah, I saw a headline just before he came on that it sounded like they'd reached some resolution.
Oh, okay.
I haven't followed the civil stuff as closely, but it sounds like they've come up with some additional conditions that he'll agree to that will allow, or that and the state will then accept the bond. So maybe they've got that figured out, but I don't know all the details yet. But again, that's just to allow him to appeal, basically, right?
Right.
Just has to post the bond so that he can appeal the civil judgment. And, I don't think it would be surprising to see that total judgment be reduced on appeal somehow. But the bond, it sounds like maybe they've resolved.
But I mean, this may just have escaped my memory, but given the amount that he basically was found liable for, that he has to pay back, the hundreds of millions of dollars, why were criminal fraud charges not pursued against him?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, and it was somewhat controversial. The former DA in New York was reportedly ready to bring this as a criminal case. And then when Alvin Bragg was elected, he chose not to bring it. And you might recall there were a couple of prosecutors who resigned from the office kind of in protest. They thought the case was all ready to bring. And then Bragg said, no, it's not ready. We're not going to do it. So I think a number of outside observers have asked that same question. It's like, why wasn't this the criminal case that you brought? This looks stronger. Now, as a former prosecutor, I'm always hesitant to second guess those judgments because from the outside, we know only a relatively small portion of the relevant information, right? So much of what goes on in a criminal investigation is protected by secrecy. And so there might have been factors at play that we just don't know about that led to that decision. So I said I'm always a little reluctant to second guess a prosecutor's motives in a situation like that. But it's certainly and we don't know, so we still don't know really the answer as to why Bragg declined to bring that case and then went back and resurrected this one, which most people think is far weaker. And this was the criminal case that he ended up bringing.
And the two federal cases, the classified documents case and the January 6th case. I know the documents one is further along. Let's start there. What's the status and some of your observations of that?
So the federal case in Florida is the documents case. That's based on the unlawful retention of the classified information at Mar-a-Lago, right? The boxes of records that were kept in his bathroom. And then hidden from investigators when they tried to recover them. Of all four cases, that's probably the strongest one. I think it's pretty open and shut.
Right.
You're just not
just
allowed
like
to
the
have...
bathroom door. Just like that bathroom door.
You're not allowed to have this stuff. And especially when they come asking for it repeatedly and you fail to return it, even if you thought initially you had a right to have it, when they ask for it repeatedly and you refuse to return it and then try to hide it from them, there's just not much in the way of a defense there. So, it's very different from finding a few stray classified documents in Joe Biden or Mike Pence's files that they didn't even know about, and they immediately return when they're found, right? I mean,
right.
This really is primarily about the obstruction and the repeated refusal to turn them over. It's not about having the documents in the first place, although the quantity of documents here is absolutely, and the deliberateness with which they were taken is also unusual. So that's a really, really strong case, but the problem is they have a judge who's really dragging her feet. And she's a relatively new judge, whether it's from inexperience or, as some suggest, because of bias towards Trump, who appointed her. She's just really taking forever on issues that shouldn't take that long. And it appears that case is going to drag out past the election. If it does, and of course, if Trump wins re-election, then with both of the federal cases, the assumption is he'll cancel them, right? He'll order his attorney general to just drop them. So we're in a really unique situation here, not just in the Florida case, but the January 6th case in D.C., the other federal case. We've never had a situation before where a criminal defendant might end up with the power to cancel his own prosecution if the case doesn't get to trial in time. So there's a lot of urgency in the DC case for the Supreme Court to decide quickly, and maybe that case can still get to trial before the election. But that window seems to be rapidly closing. Yeah, where it would be possible to get that done.
We've covered Eileen Cannon before, the judge down in Florida, who's making the determinations really on this timeline and the fact that she was a Trump appointee. What you're referring to with the Supreme Court, how they're hearing oral arguments on his absolute immunity claims in the next day or so. It's widely expected that they'll basically throw it out and essentially say, there's no way that a president can claim they have absolute immunity from prosecution because of the nature of the office. That's kind of very much against the spirit of everything that America was supposed to be about as an anti-monarchy constitution, basically. But the point is really what you say, is that they decided to even hear arguments, which delays all of this because of the fact that it's going to happen late April. Then they can't even get started until after this is decided. Right.
I mean, they could have taken it. I mean, Jack Smith asked them to take it immediately, to skip the DC circuit altogether and just take the case. That was back in December, I think. And they declined, but then they ended up taking it in February. And we're hearing arguments on Thursday. So they don't seem to be proceeding as though they see a lot of urgency. And in a normal case, that would be understandable. In a normal case, you'd say, well, it's not their fault, when the case came to them. And why should this be sped up just because the case didn't arrive to them in time? We should just take it in the ordinary course and we'll decide it like we decide any case. There's no reason to speed things up. But this is a unique case, like I said. We've never before had a situation where if he wins re-election and this case has not gone to trial, it's never going to go to trial. And the people have a right to have these charges tried, right? And the public has a right to a trial as well, not just the defendant. And because of that, they really need to step up and accelerate this decision. But they're not showing any signs of being willing to do that.
And then how does this affect the January 6th case, the other Jack Smith federal case?
Well, that's the one that I'm talking about.
Okay.
That's the one where they're arguing the Supreme Court. The Florida case, that's just dragging on because of Judge Cannon. It's the DC
I'm sorry,
case.
I thought it affected both.
No, not really.
Okay.
No, it's it's appeal from the DC case that the Supreme Court's hearing arguments on Thursday, and of course that case has been on hold ever since Judge Chutkan denied his immunity claims. So that's the one, and that's the January 6th case in some ways, in terms of, protecting our democracy and things like that. That's the most important case of all,
right.
And if the Supreme Court doesn't act quickly enough and he happens to win a re-election, then that case may never get to trial.
And it's also concerning because the Fulton County case seems to have a lot of issues cropping up, given Fani Willis being quite reckless, honestly, with some of her personal entanglements. I know the right has seized on it, and it's not relevant, but you have to be very buttoned up when you're dealing with something that important for our democracy. I know this is not this is maybe a little bit out of your purview or what you focus on, but that's kind of I'm curious what your assessment is of that last major case that Trump's dealing with.
Right. So it's also based on the January 6th events, but even before all the distractions about the DA and the man that she hired being involved, even before that, this is just a really unwieldy case. 19 defendants, the state RICO charge. They've got another big RICO case going on in Georgia right now, where it took them months and months to pick a jury, and the trial itself is projected to last well into next year or beyond. Just because when you get that many defendants, and everybody's getting up to cross-examine every witness, and everybody's filing all their motions, and it's just an enormous, unwieldy case. So one of the things that was smart about Jack Smith's DC case, it was kind of a rifle shot. He charged only Trump, relatively narrow set of charges, gave himself the best possible chance of going to trial before the election. I think Georgia is just
Right.
bogged down. It's just, like I said, very large
Too
and unwieldy
span,
case.
too
Yeah.
many defendants, too broad, but they would probably argue, how else can we make a RICO case without kind of expanding it to this broad conspiracy, right?
Right, but you don't have to make it a RICO case. I
Wow.
mean, you could have filed 3 or 4 separate smaller cases against different groups of defendants, for different aspects of the scheme, and really narrowed your focus. Or they could have filed cases just against Trump for now, thinking that they could come back later and get some of these other defendants. So, which is what Jack Smith did. I expect if Trump is not reelected, we're going to see more charges in DC from Jack Smith after the election, when it will no longer bog down his case. And he could indict some of these other 6 co-conspirators, separately in new cases. And you could have taken a similar approach in Georgia, but then instead they went all in, and
Right.
it was splashy and it generated a lot of headlines, but actually getting a case like that to trial is kind of a nightmare.
Well, really appreciate your time today and explaining this all to our audience, and helping me out too in parsing this. Randall Eliason, you can read the blog Sidebars to keep up to date on this. And I saw you're also writing a bit about what's going on with Menendez and his trial as well,
Oh yeah,
which maybe we'll have you back on to talk a bit about that. I'm from New Jersey, so I have a bit of a special interest keeping an eye on that.
great.
Randall Eliason, professor of white collar criminal law at GW, former assistant U.S. attorney for D.C., and the blog is called Sidebars. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.